In November of 1910, 6 men boarded a private train car in New Jersey using fake names. And during the 7 days they spent locked in a secret compound off the coast of Georgia, they designed a system that would allow them to create money out of nothing, lend it to the government at interest, and extract wealth from every American for the next century. And the reason you've never heard this story is because if people understood what actually happened on Jekyll Island, they would demand the immediate abolition of the Federal Reserve. But here's what they did. J.P. Morgan and his partners, representing 1/4 of the entire world's wealth, met in total secrecy to create what they called a central bank, but what was actually a private corporation owned by bankers that would have the legal power to print dollars and charge the American government interest on money created from nothing. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a conspiracy fact documented in congressional records, admitted by the participants themselves years later, and it's still operating today, right now, this second. The Federal Reserve is creating money that didn't exist yesterday and using it to buy government bonds, which means you pay taxes to cover interest on money that was literally invented. And once you understand how this scam works, you'll never look at a dollar bill the same way again. The 6 men on that train represented more money than most countries possessed. Nelson Aldrich, senator from Rhode Island and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., the Rockefeller family's representative in Washington. King G. Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, the most powerful private bank in America. Frank Vanderlip, president of National Sea Bank, representing the Rockefeller interests directly. Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust, who would become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn Loeb and Company, representing the European banking dynasties, including the Rothschilds. These weren't government officials working for the public interest. These were private bankers working for their own profit. And they traveled under assumed names, telling people they were going duck hunting, because if anyone discovered that the richest men in America were secretly meaning to redesign the monetary system, there would have been riots. But they succeeded. And 3 years later, in 1913, they got their central bank, and your family has been paying for it ever since. Here's what they were running from. Here's why they needed secrecy. Twice before, America had tried central banking, first with the First Bank of the United States from 1791 to 1811, then the Second Bank from 1816 to 1836. And both times, the American people recognized these institutions for what they were. Private monopolies that enriched bankers while controlling the nation's money supply. And both times, the banks were abolished. Andrew Jackson literally ran for president on the platform of killing the second bank. And when he succeeded, he said it was the greatest accomplishment of his presidency. He understood that allowing private bankers to control money creation was allowing them to control the country. But by 1910, the bankers were back. They had spent 70 years consolidating wealth and power, and they were ready to try again. But this time they were smarter. This time they would make it look like government control while ensuring private profit. They would call it federal, even though it wasn't. They would call it reserve, even though it would have no reserves. They would call it a system, even though it would be controlled by a small group at the top. And most importantly, they would create it in secret so that by the time the public understood what happened, it would be too late to stop. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened on Jekyll Island, because this is where everything changed. The island was owned by a private club that J.P. Morgan and his partners belonged to, a winter retreat for the richest families in America, and they chose it specifically because they could control who came and went. No staff, no witnesses, no records, just 6 men and 1 week to redesign American money. They met in what's now called the Jekyll Island Club Hotel on 4/7. Days they worked on the plan, arguing over details, writing and rewriting, trying to create something that Congress would accept, but that would still give bankers what they wanted, which was control. And what they came up with was brilliant in its design. They would create 12 regional Federal Reserve banks spread across the country, which would make it look decentralized and democratic, but all 12 would be controlled by the Federal Reserve Board in Washington and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which J.P. Morgan would dominate. They would make the board members appointed by the president, which would make it look like government oversight. But the actual power would rest with the banks themselves, who would own shares and elect directors. And most cleverly, they would give this system the power to create money and lend it to the government, which meant they could profit from the national debt forever. What would you do if I told you that every dollar in your wallet, right? Now, every dollar in your bank account, every dollar of the national debt was created by a private corporation and loaned to the government at interest that you pay through taxes? This is not speculation. This is how the Federal Reserve works right now. They create money out of nothing through computer entries. They use this invented money to buy treasury bonds, which are government IOUs, and you pay taxes to cover the interest on bonds bought with money that didn't exist until the moment they created it. The national debt is $35 trillion. And every penny of interest on that debt goes to the Federal Reserve and its member banks. And this is what JP Morgan and his partners designed on Jekyll Island, a system where they profit from lending the government money they created from nothing. And the more the government borrows, the richer they become. And you are never supposed to understand this, because if you did, you'd realize the whole thing is a scam. If you're starting to feel rage build as you understand that the monetary system was literally designed by private bankers to extract wealth from you, stay with me, because what comes next shows you exactly how much this has cost your family over the last century. And understanding these numbers is the only way to protect yourself from what's coming. Subscribe now, because very few people will explain this as directly as I'm about to. The plan they created on Jekyll Island wasn't presented to Congress as the work of bankers. That would have been political suicide. Instead, Senator Aldrich presented it as the Aldrich Plan, a banking reform proposal developed by the National Monetary Commission after years of study. But the problem was that everyone knew Aldrich was connected to the banks. He was Rockefeller's father-in-law, and he represented banking interests in the Senate. So when he presented the plan in 1911, it was immediately attacked as a banker's scheme, and it failed. But the bankers didn't give up. They just rebranded. When Woodrow Wilson won the presidency in 1912 on a Democratic platform that opposed central banking and Wall Street control, the bankers worked behind the scenes to create a new version of the Aldrich Plan that looked different but was fundamentally the same. They called it the Federal Reserve Act, and they presented it as a way to break the power of Wall Street banks by creating government control over money, which was the opposite of what it actually did. And they got key Democrats, including Wilson himself, to support it by convincing them it would prevent the kind of financial panics that JP Morgan had used to consolidate power. The Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 1913, Latchy Hatch night, when many congressmen had already left Washington for Christmas. And this timing was deliberate. The bankers knew that if there was full debate and public attention, the bill would face serious opposition, but by rushing it. During the holidays when public attention was elsewhere, they got it passed, and Wilson signed it into law. And years later, allegedly on his deathbed, although this is disputed, Wilson said that he had unwittingly ruined his country, that he had been deceived by the bankers into signing away America's monetary independence. Whether he actually said this or not, the effect was the same. The Federal Reserve was now law, and the bankers who met on Jekyll Island had won. They had their central bank, and they had structured it exactly as planned, looking federal but operating for private profit. Here's how the scam works and why it's cost your family hundreds of thousands of dollars. When the government needs money, let's say to pay for wars or programs or bailouts, instead of Congress creating that money directly as the Constitution originally allowed, the Treasury issues bonds, which are promises to pay back money plus interest, and the Federal Reserve buys these bonds. But here's the key part. The Fed doesn't buy them with money it has. It creates new money in that exact moment through electronic credits. Money that did not exist 1 second before. And this newly created money goes to the government, which spends it into the economy buying goods and services. And you might think, well, that's fine. The government got money and spent it. But here's the problem. The Fed now holds those bonds and you pay taxes to cover the interest, which means you're paying interest on money that was created from nothing. Let me say that again, because it's so insane that most people don't believe it the first time they hear it. The Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, lends it to the government, and you pay taxes to cover interest on money that never existed until they invented it. And this is completely legal. This is the system designed on Jekyll Island. But it gets worse because the money created by the Fed isn't given to you. It goes to the government and 2 banks first. And by the time it reaches your paycheck through wages, it's already been spent by others. Which means every time the Fed creates new money, the dollars you already have become worth less because there are more total dollars chasing the same amount of goods. This is what causes inflation. And inflation is a hidden tax that transfers wealth from everyone who holds dollars to everyone who gets the new dollars first, which means from you to the government and banks. And this is exactly what JP Morgan and Rockefeller wanted, a system where they could create money, profit from lending it, and extract wealth through inflation, all while the public blamed rising prices on greedy businesses or foreign countries or anything except the actual cause, which is money creation by the Federal Reserve. Now, let me show you what this has cost you in real terms, because these aren't just abstract economic concepts. This is money stolen directly from your family. In 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, the average house cost $3,500, and the average worker made about $750 a year, which means you could buy a house for roughly 4 to 5 years of wages. Today, the average house costs $400,000, and the average worker makes about $60,000, which means it takes 6 to 7 years of wages. But actually, it's worse than that, because the median house price in many cities is $600,000 or $800,000, or in places like California, over $1 million, which means it now takes 10 to 15 years of wages to buy a house compared to 4 to 5 years in 1913. The dollar has lost 98% of its value since the Federal Reserve was created, which means something that cost $1 in 1913 costs $50 today. And this isn't natural. This is the direct result of the Fed creating money, which causes inflation, which steals your purchasing power, and the people who benefit are the ones who get the new money first, which is banks and government and the wealthy who own assets that rise in price, while workers and savers get destroyed because their wages and savings buy less every year. Think about what this means for your life right now. Your parents or grandparents could buy a house on one income with a high school education and support a family. They could save money in a bank account and retire comfortably. They could work for 30 years at one company and get a pension. But you can't do any of that because the money created by the Federal Reserve has inflated asset prices, while wages stayed flat. And this isn't because you're less capable or less hardworking than your grandparents. This is because the monetary system designed on Jekyll Island is systematically transferring wealth from workers to asset owners, from savers to borrowers, from the productive economy to the financial economy, and JP Morgan and Rockefeller knew exactly what they were creating. A machine that would extract wealth from the middle class and deposit it into the accounts of people like them. And it's been running for 112 years, and it's still running right now. But here's what really should terrify you. What happened in 2008 proves the Federal Reserve isn't working for you at all. When the banks that own the Federal Reserve made catastrophically bad bets on mortgage-backed securities and derivatives and nearly collapsed the entire financial system, who did the Fed save? Not homeowners who lost their houses, not workers who lost their jobs, not savers who lost their retirement accounts. The Fed saved the banks, creating $16 trillion out of nothing through quantitative easing and secret loans to bail out the exact same institutions that caused the crisis. $16 trillion created from nothing and given to banks while you got nothing, while your house value collapsed, while your job disappeared, while your 401k got cut in half. And this is the system working exactly as designed because the Federal Reserve doesn't work for the American people. It works for the banks that own it. And those banks are the heirs of JP Morgan and Rockefeller and the same interests that met on Jekyll Island in 1910. The proof that the Federal Reserve is a private institution serving private interests is in the details they don't want you to examine. The Fed is not funded by Congress. It's funded by the interest it collects on bonds and by fees charged to banks, which means it doesn't answer to voters or taxpayers. It answers to its own board, which is dominated by bankers. The regional Federal Reserve banks are owned by member banks, which are private corporations. When you look up who owns the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is the most powerful regional bank, you find it's owned by Citibank, JP Morgan, Chase, Goldman, Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and other Wall Street banks. These banks elect 6 of the 9 directors of the New York Fed, and those directors oversee operations that benefit their own institution. This is not a government agency. This is a private cartel that was given government power through the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913 based on a plan created in secret by the bankers themselves. And they've protected this arrangement so successfully that most Americans still think the Fed is part of the government when it's actually the greatest scam in American history. So why did JP Morgan and Rockefeller go to such lengths to create this system? What were they really after? They wanted control not just of their own money, but of everyone's money. Because whoever controls money creation controls the economy, and whoever controls the economy controls the country. And they understood that if they could establish a central bank that had the legal monopoly on creating dollars, they would have power that exceeded government power because government would depend on them for funding. This is why every time Congress wants to spend money on war or programs or anything else, they don't raise it through taxes, which would be politically unpopular They borrow it from the Federal Reserve, which creates it from nothing. And this borrowing creates the national debt, which is now $35 trillion and growing. And every dollar of that debt generates interest payments that go to the Fed and its member banks. And these interest payments are funded by your taxes, which means you work to pay interest on money that was created from nothing to a private institution that's owned by banks. And this is what JP Morgan designed. This is what Rockefeller wanted. This is what they built on Jekyll Island. Here's what they didn't tell Congress when they sold the Federal Reserve Act. Here's what was hidden in the plan from the beginning. The Federal Reserve would have the power to set interest rates, which means it could make credit expensive or cheap depending on what benefited banks. It would have the power to bail out failing banks using money created from nothing, which means banks could take enormous risks knowing they'd be rescued. It would have the power to buy government bonds with created money, which means it could monetize unlimited government debt. And it would have zero accountability to voters because it wasn't technically part of the government. And all of these powers have been used exactly as you'd expect. The Fed keeps interest rates low when banks need cheap credit to speculate. It raises rates when workers start getting wage increases to prevent inflation. That would hurt bondholders. It creates trillions to bail out banks in crises while letting regular people lose everything. And it monetizes government debt, which allows unlimited spending without the political cost of raising taxes. And through all of this, the banks that own the Fed get richer while you get poorer. And this was the plan all along. What JP Morgan and Rockefeller understood, but what most people still don't realize, is that inflation isn't rising prices. Inflation is the increase in the money supply, and rising prices are the symptom of inflation. And when the Federal Reserve creates money, which it does constantly, it causes inflation, which destroys the value of your wages and savings. But here's the critical part. Inflation doesn't affect everyone equally. If you own assets like stocks or real estate, inflation makes you richer because asset prices rise faster than the money supply increases. But if you live on wages or savings, inflation makes you poorer because your purchasing power declines while asset prices you can't afford keep rising. And this is the wealth transfer mechanism built into the Federal Reserve System. Money is created which benefits asset owners first, inflation results which hurts wage earners, and over time wealth concentrates at the top while the middle class gets hollowed out. And this is why, since 1970, when the Fed really accelerated money creation, the wealth gap has exploded. It's not because of capitalism or technology or globalization. It's because the Federal Reserve is systematically transferring wealth from people who work to people who own. Here's the document they don't want you to see. Here's the smoking gun that proves everything. In 1936, one of the original conspirators, Frank Vanderlip, who represented the Rockefellers on Jekyll Island, wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post admitting the entire thing. He wrote, quote, "I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. Discovery we knew simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. And yet this is exactly what happened, the bill they wrote. In secret on Jekyll Island became the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913, and Vanderlip admitted it 23 years later. And nobody cared. The system was already entrenched. The banks were already in control, and the American people were already too dependent on the Federal Reserve to abolish it, even after learning it was created through conspiracy by the bankers themselves. So eerie reality, 112 years after JP Morgan and Rockefeller locked themselves in a private compound and designed a system to control America's money, and that system is still operating, still creating money from nothing, still lending it at interest, still causing inflation that destroys your purchasing power, still bailing out banks while you lose your house, still transferring wealth from workers to owners. And most Americans still don't understand how any of this works because the bankers designed it to be complicated and boring and technical so you wouldn't pay attention while they robbed you. The Federal Reserve isn't federal. It has no reserves. It's not part of the government. It's owned by private banks. It creates money from nothing and charges interest on it. It causes inflation that steals your wealth, and it was created in secret by the richest men in America for their own benefit. And every single day it continues to operate. You get poorer while they get richer. And the only reason this continues is because not enough people understand what happened on Jekyll Island in November of 1910. But here's what JP Morgan and Rockefeller didn't anticipate. Here's what gives me some hope that this won't last forever. They designed a system that depends on public ignorance, and the internet is making it impossible to keep people ignorant. Every year, more people discover how the Federal Reserve actually works. Every crisis reveals the scam more clearly. Every bailout proves whose interests the Fed really serves, and eventually enough people will understand that something has to change. Now you understand, the Federal Reserve was created by private bankers in secret to benefit themselves. It creates money from nothing and charges interest. Inflation is the result of money creation, not greedy businesses. Every crisis the Fed claims to solve was caused by the system itself, and you can never unknow this. And the question is what you do with this knowledge, because if enough people understand how they're being robbed, the system becomes impossible to maintain. But if people stay ignorant or divided or distracted, the scam continues forever. If this revelation about Jekyll Island and JP Morgan and the Federal Reserve has fundamentally changed how you see money and power in America, if you're finally understanding that the game was rigged from the beginning by people with names and faces who met in secret and wrote the rules to benefit themselves, if you're angry that you've been working your entire life to pay interest on money created from nothing to a private institution owned by banks, then you need to see what we reveal next, because the Federal Reserve is just one mechanism of control, and there are others operating right now that make the Fed look almost innocent by comparison. Subscribe now and prepare to discover how these same banking interests used the Federal Reserve they created to destroy the gold standard in 1971, how they created the petrodollar system that forces every country to use dollars for oil, and how they're planning to replace physical cash with central bank digital currencies that would give them total surveillance and control over every transaction you make. Because once you see the complete system, you'll understand that Jekyll Island in 1910 wasn't the end of the plan. It was just the beginning. And what's coming next will make you realize why understanding monetary history isn't academic curiosity, it's survival.